Well, this was an odd one, wasn't it? No live TV coverage for this game made experiencing it rather bizarre, but watching through the full match as a VOD painted a vastly different picture to what was described on the audio commentary. So, what really happened during this game, and how did we win? Let's find out. Lads, lasses and the rest of the masses, welcome back to the channel. I'm Mono from Mono CFC and this is my post-match tactical breakdown for Chelsea vs AFC Wimbledon. This was our first game of the Carabao Cup, which saw Chelsea take on League 2 side AFC Wimbledon at Stamford Bridge in a game that ended in a narrow 2-1 victory to our Chelsea Blues. Let's dive in, shall we? This match was clearly a game of two halves, and proved my point a lot in terms of who could have and should have started this game. I'm going to start off by talking about the first half, which wasn't a very good showing from Chelsea, not in terms of playing badly, but just not putting the final touches on the chances created and being unable to really trouble the incredibly solid defence of Wimbledon. Side note, most of what I will be talking about in this game will be focused on Chelsea's performance specifically. I think Wimbledon played about as perfectly as they could have done in terms of trying to stay in the game and create chances where they could, and they made it incredibly difficult for us at times. But overall, I think the main reason they did so well was because of how lacklustre Chelsea were, and more specifically a handful of our starting 11 were. Before I talk about our system, I do want to highlight the players I thought were good, and who wasn't as good. I think we saw a clear discrepancy between the young players that are ready to play for this team and those that aren't quite yet. The entire backline was solid, though I do have some questions about Humphrey's starting position, which I'll talk about later. Despite what you have probably seen/heard, Cucurella was actually really good in this one. Ugochukwu looked incredibly comfortable, as did Maatsen. Gallagher and Madueke were the best players on the pitch, and then there's Moreira and Burstow. Now, if you watched my preview for this match, you know there was a reason I left these two guys on the bench for Jackson and Sterling, and this half proved me right. Firstly, Degsy, he was probably the worst player on the pitch in a blue shirt. His decision making wasn't perfect, his first touch let him down, for some reason he was on corners and only one of them was any good. Overall, he had a debut to forget. But again, I do have questions about his position because he is way more suited to playing on the right, and I do think that hampered him somewhat. He didn't look comfortable taking on players and looked lost at times, not knowing where to go or who to pass to. And the other culprit, Burstow. I said in my preview that this guy simply wasn't ready to play for Chelsea yet, and boy was I correct. I think he touched the ball about 3 times during this entire half, didn't get on the end of any crosses that came his way, and wasn't the focal point, Jackson, that we needed up top. We saw this become abundantly clear when Jackson was put on, and we improved instantly. Now let's talk about the system. Chelsea continued to use a 4-3-3 system, but it operated in a vastly different way. It still swapped into a 3-4-3 in possession, but instead of one of the fullbacks getting high and the centre-backs shifting across, as we've come to expect, we actually saw both fullbacks go high, and Leslie Ugochukwu dropping into that central centre-back spot in the first phase. He would make his way further up the pitch as the team progressed, but this was his starting position most of the time. With both fullbacks high up the pitch, the plan seemed to be to create an overload on either side, with these two triangles forming by the bylines, Diego, Cucurella and Maatsen on this left hand side, and Madueke, Humphreys and Gallagher on the right hand side. This would create a 3v2 on that side, and leave a man free to get in behind the very compact and narrow Wimbledon side. Because of how narrow they were, we were pretty much forced to play around the outside, and the middle was incredibly congested, and I do think this contributed to why Burstow didn't have the greatest game. He was for the most part crowded out by bodies, and perhaps that's why he couldn't impact the game as much as he'd have liked. This system was working, no doubts about that, but the issue was pretty much individual errors or lack of cohesion in those triangles. I've spoken about how Diego was not particularly on the ball in this one, which made this triangle unsuccessful, and whilst the other triangle brought us more success, it was hampered by Humphreys being the fullback. He's not a natural fullback and not naturally right-sided either, so he was incredibly reluctant to push up high and overlap, unlike Cucurella was doing on the opposite side. Which was a shame because when he did overlap, we made some good chances. It just didn't happen as often as I'd have liked because he was more comfortable having the ball on his left foot and passing inwards than being on his right foot. The other thing to note was Martsen's position. Because he was drifting all along the line and dragging away players, this allowed Cucurella to tuck in sometimes into the midfield and play inverted, with Diego pushing out wide or making runs in behind. On the opposite side, this didn't happen as much because, again, Bash isn't a natural fullback, but Noni would instead cut inside when he could. I talk a lot about the footedness of players and how important it is to be able to play the ball to someone on their natural foot, because it significantly slows down how fast you can play the ball down the line if you're on the wrong side. When you are playing against a solid defensive unit like this, as I spoke about in my videos about Luton, you have to be able to get the ball from one side of the pitch to the other quickly before the defence has a chance to shift over. Let me show you an example. Say the defence is defending this right hand side of the pitch like this. If we want to play the ball to the other side, we do something like this. Noni to Leslie, Leslie plays it to Cucurella. It's that second pass that's important, so let's focus on it. When Ugochukwu plays this pass to Cucurella, he plays it onto his natural foot here, so he can take one touch on the inside of his left foot, then immediately set Moreira off with a ball down the line, before the defenders can fully get across and settled. If this goes the other way to Bash, as his instep is on this side as a left-footed player, he's more inclined to go backwards than forwards in the first place, but more importantly, he has to take an extra touch in order to play that same pass. One touch to control the ball, one to face the right direction, and then the final touch to play the pass. That extra touch doesn't seem like a big deal, but in a game like football where the margins are so slim, this is usually the difference between Madueke receiving the ball over here in space, or whilst being marked. If he's in space, he can run at players as soon as he receives the ball, but if there is a man behind him, he's more likely to play the ball backwards and recycle it. Overall, it just slows down our play and makes us more predictable, and that exact thing is partly why we weren't able to break down Wimbledon. We didn't play fast enough and let them stay in their shape. Let's talk about the first goal, shall we? I got a lot of comments on my West Ham review saying that I was, quote, being sour when I said that the officiating in that game was bad. I think I was personally pretty spot on when I called out how bad English referees are, and this game was another perfect example of that. This all starts when Ugochukwu gets caught on the ball by Wimbledon pressing well in the midfield and winning it back, which they did really well all game to their credit. In truth, this was pretty much the only thing he did wrong in the half. They play the ball up to Nerfville, who feels Gallagher's hand on his back and takes a rather pathetic dive, which astonishingly the referee gives as a free kick. Let's be honest, this is never a free kick, but I can see why the ref has been conned here. The ball is whipped into the box and Sanchez comes out and punches it away, and whilst the defenders are scrambling trying to clear the ball, the referee points to the spot in what is one of the worst penalty calls I've seen in a while. The biggest man on the pitch, other than the goalies, Harry Pell, falls to the ground clutching his face in a performance of play acting that David Luiz would be proud of. There's no VAR in round 2 of the Cup, but if there was, this undoubtedly would have been overturned because Sanchez clearly punches the ball and not the man. Regardless, James Tilley steps up and blasts it down the middle for 1-0, and Chelsea have to come from behind in order to win, which, considering the two sets of players, we should be expected to be able to do. That wasn't the only penalty decision that happened this half either, because we managed to get back into the game via our own penalty. This all comes from a piece of individual brilliance from Noni Madueke, turning on a sixpence and beating Ryan Johnson, who admittedly couldn't live with a winger for the majority of the game. He dribbles past another into the box before being clumsily hacked down by Alex Pearce. Noni pretty comfortably sends the keeper the wrong way and slots the ball into the opposite side for 1-1. This is where another piece of dodgy officiating comes into play, because this pen should admittedly have been retaken. There was encroachment from both sets of players and the goalkeeper wasn't on his line when the ball was struck either. Overall, this was just a mess, but we take it, I suppose. That was one of the last things that happened before the second half, but before we talk about that, real quick, if you're enjoying the content and want to see more, please consider subscribing to the channel. Cheers. Alright, so what happened in the second half and how did we eventually win? Well, to put it simply, it was just a matter of player quality in the end. We made a few substitutions and brought on players that I personally thought should have started, and Wimbledon didn't have that same type of player to bring off the bench to impact the game. At the start of the second half, we saw Moreira rightfully recalled and Nico Jackson come on to play up top alongside Mason Burstow. This changed our formation slightly, with Nico being a more central player. It was almost a hybrid of a 4-4-2 and a 4-3-3, with Jackson playing as a left forward/winger. This immediately improved us as Jackson was able to impact play with his fantastic link-up play down the left-hand side and into more central areas, something we didn't see with Burstow in the first half. He really made the tempo of the game rise, and because of that, along with Al-Hamadi also speeding things up for Wimbledon, the game started to open up and more spaces were available in the centre of the pitch, especially on the transition. Wimbledon were clearly struggling to maintain the same level of defensive astuteness because of how tired they seemed to get in the latter stages, along with how fast the ball was being passed around, and further substitutions from Chelsea really put the nails into the coffin. Enzo Fernandez and Malo Gusto came on, and this shifted the team into a more recognisable one, with Bashir Humphreys now able to play in his natural position, and Gusto able to be dangerous on the overlap down the right hand side. Enzo immediately started to dictate things in the middle, and due to Burstow coming off, Jackson could play more centrally, and we went back to a more typical 4-3-3 with Maatsen playing like a narrow left winger. More substitutes came later, but it's in this formation that we managed to go ahead in the game, courtesy of a long-range effort from Enzo Fernandez. This all comes from one of those fast transitions. It starts from a goal kick to Wimbledon, they commit men forward, but the ball ends up in the hands of Robert Sanchez, who also had a really good game if you exclude the silly penalty call, who does what he does best as he gets us running up the pitch for a counter with a rolled ball to Cucurella. On his favoured left-hand side, he's able to blast a pass down the line for an advancing Ian Maatsen, but unfortunately overhits the pass. Bass tries to clear it coming out far from his goal, but smashes the ball directly into Maatsen, giving the ball away to Enzo, who rather easily places it into the empty net for our winning goal. The rest of the half played out similarly to the start of the half, Chelsea creating numerous chances and forcing Bass into a few quality saves, but ultimately not scoring any more. Wimbledon weren't able to create much else in the game except in the closing stages when Al-Hamadi got behind the lines late on and had to be brilliantly denied by the ever impressive Axel Disasi. That was the story of this game really. Chelsea are going through to round 3, but were not particularly convincing against a lower league side that really showed up and made it as difficult as they possibly could. We've been drawn against our recent rivals Brighton and Hove Albion in the next round, but before we get to that we move on to a home tie against Nottingham Forest in the league, which will be a decent test and will hopefully bring us 3 points to get up the table even further. And finally, before the end of the video, it's time for the question of the day. As always, I'm going to highlight some of the comments from the last video, so here are a few responses to the last question of the day. Thanks guys for your continued support, as ever. If you want your comment to be featured in the next video, leave your answer to this video's question of the day down below with QOTD at the start. So for this week's question of the day, we'll go for an interesting one. After seeing how we struggled in this one, are you worried about our squad depth or not, and why? But that was just my tactical breakdown for this match. Thank you ever so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts on this match in the comment section below, and if you'd be so kind, subscribe to the channel and leave the video a like if you enjoyed. Don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a video from me, or check out some of the other videos on the channel on screen right now. I've been Mono from Mono CFC, and remember, in the rain or in the dry, keep that blue flag flying high. Come on you Blues!